"This isn't about judicial interpretation, Justice Alito," Jasmine Crockett said flatly, leaning into the mic. "It's about selective memory dressed up as tradition." The room cracked. Camera flashes popped like distant thunder. Senate aides froze mid-scribble. One Republican consultant coughed just to fill the silence. Judge Alito blinked slowly, then narrowed his gaze not as a jurist surprised, but as a man who finally realized he misread the room he had just invoked. Founder's intent to deflect a question about modern corruption. Crockett didn't flinch. She flipped it. "You cite originalism to avoid every moral obligation this court has ducked for decades. But if we're going back to the founders," she tilted her head, voice steady, ... then tell me, was bribery ethical when it came with crystal glassware and lifetime appointments? Or is that part of the original clause too? Alito opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked down. CNN's Chiron operator would later say it was the longest 3 seconds of his career trying to decide what label to run: debate, silence, or regret. It was only supposed to be a hearing, an exploratory ethics panel with handshakes and hedges. But this was beginning to look like a trial, and Jasmine Crockett wasn't the one under fire. Alito's rhythma. Lifetime of murmured evasions. Self-satisfied smirks and question-dodging jargon had just been halted. Not by rage, not by scandal, but by a woman trained in the law, raised in the fire, and unafraid to say what decorum had long protected: that robes don't make gods, and the law isn't holy when wielded as a weapon. The silence that followed wasn't respectful. It was reverent, like witnesses at a turning point. But to understand how this all exploded, we need to rewind 72 hours to the moment Jasmine Crockett realized Alito wasn't playing legal chess. He was playing ideological roulette. 72 hours earlier, the briefing room was quiet, but the silence wasn't peace. It was pressure. Representative Jasmine Crockett stood facing a digital wall of scrolling headlines. Alito under fire, agonethics in question. SCOTUS on trial, will anyone dare hold him accountable? One of her senior aides, voice sharp with quiet frustration, summed up what the team already knew. He's going to invoke independence. Float a few Latin phrases, reference judicial restraint, then walk out untouched again. Crockett didn't answer. She was reading the second page of a leaked memo. A line caught her eye. Justice Alito reserves the right to decline hypothetical scenarios that may confuse the public. Understanding of judicial responsibility in legalese. That meant one thing: evasion baked into the strategy. This wasn't about getting answers. It was about smokescreens. Pushed through centuries of polite traditions that wrapped power in robes and assumed deference would silence dissent. Jasmine knew better. The headlines weren't all bark. There were receipts. Luxury fishing trips with billionaire donors. Draft opinion leaks that eerily matched far-right talking points. Podcasts and speeches hinting at real Americans versus cultural decline. Ties to religious activists who'd argued cases before his bench individually. It all looked distantly drama in marble buildings. But put together, it was a blueprint. A judicial strategy not to interpret the Constitution, but to entrench a worldview. One where minorities exist quietly. Women obey originalist timelines. The poor are seen but not heard. And anyone who speaks fire is accused of burning the system. This hearing had become a national lightning rod because something had shifted. It wasn't just legal scholars watching, it was single moms tired of living under rulings that outlawed their futures. It was college kids who hadn't known the name Samuel Alito until their rights vanished. With a Supreme Court press release, it was the communities who knew the law. Could be a shield or a sword, and too often men like Alito chose the latter. Now this hearing was trending on social media before it even began. Viewers across the country weren't tuning in for procedure. They wanted one thing America rarely delivers: accountability. But Crockett also knew what would happen the moment she spoke plainly. They'd say she was feisty, emotional, disrespectful, unprofessional even. As Alito danced circles around facts with smirking detachment, her clarity would be seen as the breach. Still, she didn't flinch, because this wasn't just a legal forum. It was a moral referendum masquerading as an oversight meeting, and win or lose. She wasn't coming to appease the institution that had long protected men like Alito from consequences. She was coming to ask the questions no one else dared phrase without apology, and when he reached for abstract principles, she'd answer with people. Real ones. What Alito didn't know was that Crockett wasn't coming to play defense. She brought fire under every citation. Asterisk, asterisk, before Jasmine Crockett ever stepped foot into that hearing room. Samuel Alito was already a master of the game, not the law, but the performance of it. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't blink too fast. He wore the robe-like armor, the Constitution like a sword, and the smirk of a man who had been trained to never feel the weight of either. Born in Trenton, New Jersey, Alito's rise was never a mystery. It was a blueprint. Catholic roots, Ivy League law, conservative clerkships. He sat under Antonin Scalia's wing and learned the golden rule. Power doesn't need to shout, it just needs to outlast. And Alito, he was made for endurance. From early on, he carved out a brand of jurisprudence that made original intent sound noble. Even as it excluded the very people pressing against America's margins, to Alito, progress wasn't a legal concern. It was a cultural threat, best handled with procedural delay. He wasn't loud like Clarence Thomas or performative like Brett Kavanaugh. Alito wielded the pen like a whisper that cuts louder than screams, and he did it with precision. In chambers, he was patient, relentless, and coldly brilliant. But everything changed after Dobbs v. Jackson. The case that obliterated Roe v. Wade, it wasn't just the decision, it was the leak. His leak, the draft opinion, riddled with disdain for social attitudes and framed as returning power to the people, was leaked months before the ruling dropped. The leak itself? Never solved. But the writing? That was unmistakably Alito's. In it, he didn't merely overturn precedent, he celebrated it. Woven into his language was something darker than legal certitude. Ideological pleasure. It was the grin of a man who had waited decades to remake the court in his own image and was finally watching it obey. And when questioned by Congress afterward, dismissive, detached, unimpressed with the process of accountability. A man asked about ethics, who answered like ethics were beneath him. He shrugged through questions. About luxury hunting trips funded by political donors. He dodged when asked about meetings with activist lawyers. And when reminded that public trust in the court had dropped to an all-time low, he smirked, because Alito knows what the public too often forgets. Supreme Court justices don't get removed. They aren't voted out. They aren't arrested. They endure. And that endurance becomes a strategy. Not just a byproduct, critics call it jurisprudence, but beneath the marble. People like Crockett know what it really is. Shielded power. Dressed in Latin, Alito often molds originalism to fit a selective reading of history. Women considered second-class citizens in the 18th century charter. Enslaved people, infamously counted as 3/5. Workers' rights, unmentioned, but somehow. The absence of modern values is never viewed as the Constitution's failure, just proof they weren't meant to. EXISTTHA, tease the game. Invent a theory, then hide behind it. At hearings, Alito plays the same role every time, the above-it-all elder statesman. He answers with disclaimers, dodging the moral weight of his rulings with the gentle indifference of someone who believes being legally consistent is more important than being ethically correct, he once told a journalist. Deadpan. The Constitution doesn't guarantee outcomes, it protects processes. And there it was. The lifeline of every bad actor in a good suit. Because for Alito, the danger wasn't outrage, it was clarity. Clear questions threatened the machinery, and clear voices, especially from the likes of Crockett, were considered too raw, too emotional, or too far removed from the court's cloistered walls to matter two worlds. Two languages, one courtroom. And until now, Alito had always dominated both spaces by refusing to acknowledge they ever intersected. He was the judge you couldn't touch, the robe you couldn't challenge, and the ideology you couldn't expose without sounding radical. But what he'd never prepared for was someone who could speak his language and weaponize it back at him. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Jasmine Crockett didn't arrive through the front doors of power. She pushed through the side entrance with rolled-up sleeves, a borrowed textbook, and a voice sharpened by every room that tried to quiet her. Her team had warned her. This is a judicial oversight committee, not a courtroom. Don't swing too hard. It'll backfire. Alito will evade. It's what he does. Just ask your questions and exit clean. But Jasmine had heard those words before. They were dressed differently, but the meaning was always the same. This space wasn't built for you. Tread lightly. She didn't come here to tread, long before she wore a congressional pin. Crockett stood on street corners with tired mothers who got eviction notices while billionaires ran tax havens. She argued motions in overlit courtrooms where judges skimmed lines but never read hearts. And she lost cases she should have won, not because the law failed, but because the people interpreting it refused to see the humanity behind it. She remembered every word the law forgot. In law school, she was the one who asked the questions professors side-eyed, the ones that made tenure-track lawyers in training glance at the clock. What happens when precedent protects power but not people? What's the point of process if truth never gets the floor? She wasn't doing it for effect. She was doing it because she lived at one seminar. She called out a constitutional law professor for omitting the racial biases embedded in the very rulings they were glorifying. He laughed. You'll make a firebrand one day. That day came sooner than he expected. Years later, she filed civil rights suits against institutions shaped by the very doctrines. Judge Alito used to veil injustice as judicial discipline. Each time she stood across from prosecutors quoting originalist logic, she found holes. Not just inconsistencies, hypocrisies. They told her she was brave for challenging the system. She didn't want bravery. She wanted justice that practiced what it preached. And still, mostly, she heard excuses. It's complex. It's not about race. It's about structure. Change takes time. But she had seen too many people buried in that weight, and some buried because of it. So when she won her congressional seat, it wasn't a ladder rung. It was a return ticket back into the spaces that politely excluded voices like hers. They called her new to Washington. What they really meant was uncontrolled. They said she was too bold. What they really meant was not scared. She listened to her team's cautious advice, nodded politely. But inside, she was already sorting through files Alito's rulings. His footnotes, each syllable where power had been framed as logic, and injustice wrapped in ritual. She saw his pattern from a mile away. His decisions weren't neutral. They were chosen. His terminology wasn't scholarly. It was insulated, and his deference to the framers was just permission to punish modern America with the ghosts of its founding sins. Crockett understood something her colleagues struggled to say out loud. Alito didn't fear losing moral ground because in his courtroom, procedure was morality. But America didn't need more process. It needed proof that someone would say out loud, "What?" The rest of the institution whispered behind closed doors. She wasn't going to out-volume him. She was going to out-truth him, not with rage. With receipts, not with slogans. With surgical memory, because every time she watched Alito speak in public, dispassionate, remote, dismissive, she saw the faces of the clients she once represented. People crushed by decisions that used doctrine to deny their dignity. Alito may have spoken with an air of perfection, but his rulings reeked of politics hidden in poetry. Jasmine wasn't afraid of his robe. She knew what was underneath it. Every internship where she was asked to be grateful, every courtroom where her argument was labeled spirited instead of correct. Every time a judge cut her off mid-sentence and let her white male peer ramble for 10 uninterrupted minutes. Each of those memories sharpened her style. They made her deliberate, precise, unflinching. She wasn't theatrical, but she understood drama was only dangerous when you didn't know how to control it. And when the invitation came to join the oversight hearing on alleged Supreme Court ethics breaches, she didn't hesitate. The team said, "Play nice," Crockett said. "What's the ethical protocol for dismantling a doctrine built to exclude you?" They went silent. She brushed off her suit jacket, clicked open her notes, and smiled at something few people ever see in her line of work: clarity. Crockett wasn't going into that room to challenge a judge. She was going to reveal the man behind the robe, and she wasn't bringing outrage. She was bringing utter inevitability, because in all her years watching Alito twist precedent into power, she was carefully folding every contradiction, every evasion, every selective silence into the very speech she had been writing since law school. So when the courtroom lights flicked on, it wasn't just another hearing. It was the moment she'd been preparing for her entire life. Asterisk, asterisk, the hearing room echoed with official stillness. Crockett sat poised, her notepad untouched. A small nameplate sat in front of her, but the authority she carried needed no engraving. "Justice Alito," she began, her voice restrained but warm. "Thank you for your time today. I'll begin simply." He didn't look up. He didn't need to. The robe did the talking. What process does the court have in its place to address perceived conflicts of interest among its own members? Alito lifted his chin slightly. "Congresswoman, as you know, the judiciary is bound by a long-standing commitment to judicial independence is a cornerstone of our republic. Translation: we'll police ourselves." "Thanks." Crockett nodded gently. "Aside from recusal, are there written standards to determine when sponsors of travel or monetary gifts should be disclosed publicly?" Another smile measured. "Transparency exists, Congresswoman, but within the framework of judicial neutrality. We must be careful not to compromise the appearance of impartiality by appealing to shifting public sentiment." Alito was in his rhythm, now cool, bureaucratic, unflappable. Years of navigating questions without ever really answering them. His voice smooth and reassuring. The velvet rope of institutional distance. The chamber drifted into that numbing lull, the one where headlines blur. Ethics gets spun into process, and no one actually wins. Crockett, however, didn't blink. She let him dance. "Justice, do you believe that the Constitution interpreted in its original form supports the lack of binding ethical guidelines for today's Supreme Court?" His answer came easily. Too easily, the framers' Congresswoman understood the importance of checks and balances. What they intended was a judiciary that could operate without fear of public or political reprisal, which, I believe, includes maintaining a sacred autonomy. There it was, the phrase. Right. She had been waiting for. What they intended. Alito had spoken the summoning spell. Crockett was silent for a moment, long enough to make the room feel the heat that hadn't arrived yet. He thought he had just delivered a mic drop. She understood. He had just stepped into a trap she set before he opened his mouth. She gazed down at her notes, as if considering his words. Not flustered. Not defensive. Just ... quiet. Calm, cold, calculated. "You're referring to the founders' original intent," she repeated. Wrapping the phrase delicately in the same reverence he had used, he nodded. With the confidence of a man who had shaped entire doctrines around that scaffold. "Yes. And..." Crockett looked up not with fire, but with a faint smile. A flicker of something sharp behind her eyes. She had him, because wrapped inside. That one phrase was a centuries-old vulnerability he never expected to be challenged by someone who looked like her, sounded like her, or came from the America his rulings had tried to forget. She sat up straighter, gently moved her notepad aside. Theatrics weren't needed. "Just truth, Justice Alito," she said quietly, "when we speak of the founders' intent. Do we include the part where they never envisioned women like me as full citizens?" His gaze stiffened. "Do we include the part where enslaved people counted as 3/5 of a person? Or that interracial marriage was illegal in most states for longer than Snapchat has existed?" The oxygen changed. No yelling. No posturing. Just reality. dropped at the feet of a doctrine that had only ever worked in rooms that pretended justice was colorless. So, when you say what they intended, she continued softly, do you mean they intended us people like me? Born into systems they wrote without us in mind, to have no modern ethical expectations from the most powerful figures in this country? Alito leaned back. She leaned forward. You're quoting ghosts. Justice Alito. But the people living now their lives deserve more than the moral preferences of the SPSATDs. A pause. The camera operators practically held their breath, and that's when she shifted in her seat, smiled faintly, and began to dismantle 250 years of hypocrisy, using his own words. Asterisk, asterisk. Jasmine Crockett adjusted her mic. The room was still. No rustling papers. No coffee slurps. Even the aides on Alito's side of the aisle had stopped pretending to check their phones. Everyone felt it. She wasn't about to ask a question. She was about to deliver a charge, not the kind that ends in handcuffs, but the kind that puts history itself on trial. She began softly. Justice Alito, I studied your opinions. Not just the rulings, but the footnotes, the small print where the real beliefs live. He watched her with that mild wariness veteran justices wear when facing a capable mind they underestimated. But it was already too late. You often lean on the concept of original intent. It's elegant. I'll admit, purposeful, clean, and it gives your decisions a kind of historical insulation. Like you're not making a choice, you're honoring one. She tilted her head just slightly. Voice still neutral. But let me ask, when the Constitution was drafted in that moment of supposed moral clarity, who had rights? The question hung. Let's go back to 1787, she continued. Only white male landowners could vote. Women couldn't own property outright in most states. And enslaved Africans were written into the text itself. Not as humans with rights, but as fractions. 3/5. Alito shifted slightly. Just enough. So when you invoke those framers, she said, what version of America are you calling back to? The one that believed slavery was lawful? The one that thought education was optional for women? The one that would have denied every single member of this panel, except maybe you, a voice? The silence shifted again, now laced with discomfort. But you don't stop at history. You invoke tradition, she said. You argue that because something has long existed, it deserves judicial protection. She pulled out a printed page and held it up. This is your concurring opinion in the Dobbs decision, where you wrote, and I quote, the right to abortion is not deeply rooted in this nation's history and traditions. She set it down, calmly. Well, Justice Alito, neither was a married woman's right to own a bank account until 1974. Neither was Loving v. Virginia, the precedent that legalized interracial marriage until 1967. She let the years hit like punches. So if tradition is the lens, then progress becomes the threat. And under your doctrine, future can't exist unless a group of men who own people could have imagined it. Now Alito looked at her not with outrage, not with ridicule, with calculation, like someone realizing the basement they built no longer held her. You have ruled, time and time again, in ways that favor power and punish visibility, she said. Voter suppression cases, corporate immunity, even privacy. You argue the Constitution protects institutions, but you rarely speak about the people inside them. Again, she leaned forward. No theatrics. No anger. Just the blade. I went to law school because I believed, naively at first, that a good argument and the truth would be enough. Instead, I learned how tightly stitched injustice can be when it's dressed in custom robes and centuries of deference. And then the pivot. But I'm not here just to disagree with you. I'm here to decode you. Now the room was hers. You don't fear Congress or the press. You fear accountability. Because accountability breaks tradition. And tradition is the fortress you hide your ideology behind. She marked the beat. You say you're protecting the Constitution. But in reality, you're preserving a hierarchy. one in which black women like me are always seen as disruptors. Even when we're speaking the plainest truths, camera flashes snapped like lightning. And here's the real kicker. I don't want to be here tearing down a justice. I'd rather build systems up. I'd rather be teaching the next gen of lawyers how to read the law and find hope in it. But instead, I have to stand here in 2025 and ask why we still treat old ideas as sacred just because they survived the centuries. Alito looked down for a breath. The first time he'd broken eye contact all day. Crockett didn't smile. But the victory was visible in one of your earlier cases, she said, pulling out another document. You defended police officers accused of excessive force by citing qualified immunity and long-standing precedents. And when asked by critics about the moral implications, you replied, "That's not the role of the judiciary." She paused, well, respectfully. If the judiciary won't stand for morality, only for mechanisms, then what exactly are you defending? Process without purpose? Power without reflection? A few members of the committee on her side of the aisle visibly shifted in awe. Still, it's finished. I came here today to hold you accountable. Not as a political opponent, not as an ideologue, but as someone who has walked into courtrooms where your rulings echoed in real people's lives. She held for one final breath. And I'm telling you now, your tradition isn't truth. Your restraint isn't neutrality. And your robe? It doesn't hide your choices. It reveals them. The last word fell like a stone in water. Alito opened his mouth. Then closed it. He couldn't speak without confirming her. Point she hadn't raised her voice, and not once. But every sentence had landed like a gavel against centuries of pretense. Even his defenders sat frozen. She hadn't just won the exchange, she'd flipped the institution's script on live television. And the fallout was just beginning. Asterisk, asterisk, within minutes of the hearing's end. The internet detonated. No commercial break. No narrated summary. Just raw footage Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett confronting Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, torn from the C-SPAN feed and sent hurtling through social media like a truth missile. Someone uploaded the clip under the caption. She didn't yell. She didn't flinch. She dropped a constitutional TED Talk in Alito's lap. Another. Just the hashtag, #Crockett effect. By hour 2. It had gone worldwide. Talk teens layered her monologue over dramatic violin scores, Calland response mashups, even Beyoncé remixes. One clip's slow motion, cropped just to her eyes, leveling into Alito's, hit 1 million views in under 45 minutes. It didn't even have a caption. It didn't need one. Over on Twitter, or X. As it now branded itself, chaos broke into brilliance. Was that a live impeachment pitch? Plot twist. Congress just became the check on SCOTUS again. I've never been turned on by constitutional law until today. A photo of Alito looking sideways. His robe slightly bunched at the shoulder. Made the rounds as a meme. When you realize your own words just got used to kick your ideology in the teeth, conservatives attempted to attack. Disrespectful. Unhinged. Unprofessional tone for a lady congressman. But they were drowned out by wave after wave of quote tweets, ratioing them into oblivion. She cited case law. Your fave couldn't even pass the LSAT. Translation: a black woman made you. Uncomfortable by being smarter than your favorite judge. Unprofessional. Just means she didn't make y'all feel superior. Even legal Twitter. Famously sterile, exploded with complete threads about Crockett's citations. Praising how she dismantled originalism using both law and lived experience, a tactic rarely used, and even more rarely respected. One Harvard law professor posted, "This wasn't a moment of performance. It was a moment of precision. She drew blood with footnotes." New York Magazine ran the headline before sundown. Jasmine Crockett just redefined congressional oversight. And the internet noticed. Nation followed with a searing op-ed titled, "Jasmine. For justice, when black women hold the bench, accountable within 12 hours?" The quote, "Your tradition isn't truth," had been printed on t-shirts, phone cases and digital posters held high in marches from Brooklyn to Oakland. A mural went up overnight in Detroit, Comment sections turned confessional. Asterisk, asterisk, my mom cried watching this. She stopped believing in politics after Roe fell, but this gave her chills. I used to think civic engagement was a joke. Now I think it's a battlefield. And Jasmine showed up armed. She did in 5 minutes what no political influencer has done in 5 years. On YouTube. Creators paused their regular uploads to break it all down. Lawyers, activists, even former Hill staffers weighed in. Calling it the most devastating legal takedown without a gavel in hand, young viewers wrote essays in her YouTube comments, thanking her for speaking calmly and unapologetically. Teachers posted clips in AP government classes. Reddit threads filled with career changers listing her as their new reason for going to law school. But this wasn't just a social moment. Asterisk, asterisk, it was personal. For every viewer who'd ever been talked over, dismissed, misquoted, and misjudged. For every immigrant who'd been told they misunderstood America. For every woman told their passion made them less objective. For every black professional recruited for optics, then silenced for telling the truth out loud, Jasmine didn't just speak to them. She spoke as them. Asterisk, asterisk, and for the first time in recent memory. A ton of people finally felt like they were sitting in the room with power, instead of merely watching it mistreat them from behind a velvet rope. Someone tweeted, "The judiciary felt untouchable." Then Jasmine Crockett showed up with a map, a mirror, and a microphone. And the tweet landed harder than any headline. That was the wildfire. She didn't go viral for shouting. She went viral for shaking the foundation without raising her voice. And while critics scrambled, and the court issued no comment, and statements were written behind mahogany doors with gold-plated pens, the truth was still spiraling across feeds too fast to be contained. But even as millions reposted the moment, echoed the message, and crowned Jasmine the conscience of Congress. What happened inside the actual halls of power? Would send shockwaves deeper than any tweet could. Asterisk, asterisk by morning. The marble halls were humming louder than usual, not with footsteps, but with something unspoken. When Jasmine Crockett walked through the Capitol's security checkpoint, the guard didn't say much. Just nodded once, deeply, not like a salute. More like respect. She passed 2 interns in matching Hill staff lanyards. One whispered behind his hand, "That's her." The other replied without looking up. She made him blink. Upstairs. C-SPAN played the hearing clip twice before breakfast. The producer's note read, "Unedited. Historic. Watch again." Inside the Judiciary Committee anteroom. It was clear the air had changed. Several lawmakers approached her with restrained admiration like fans keeping face. Others quickly checked their phones when she entered. Dodging eye contact, unsure if silence now implied guilt or discomfort. Maybe both. A senior senator leaned over as she passed. "Hell of a moment," he muttered. "Careful, though. You cracked a few walls." Crockett smiled gently, but inside, she wasn't celebrating. Not yet. She had learned long ago that clarity from black women didn't bring applause inside powerful rooms. It brought recalibration. They didn't clap. They checked their footing. She didn't gloat. She reflected. What did it mean to speak full truth in a room built on performance? A room where decorum was often the filter used to dilute conviction. She had walked into a hearing scheduled like clockwork to 90 minutes. Pre-written questions, calculated outrage. She had turned it into a trial. Yes, but not of Alito alone. She had put the system on notice, not with slogans, but with originalist footnotes and lived truth. And she had done it without yelling, posturing, or pandering for clips. She let history speak and simply let them hear it through her voice. But even victory felt complicated. There was no clear line between making history and being turned into a highlight. Real. She'd seen it before. Moments like this get turned into memes before they're digested as meaning. That's why. When her cum staff handed her a list of interview requests, Rachel, Joy, Jake, even one from someone she'd clashed with before, she surprised them all. "No," she said. "You want to issue a statement?" her chief of staff asked. Jasmine shook her head. "Let the clip speak," she said. "If I start explaining what America already felt, I'm doing their job for them." Instead, she went home, kicked off her shoes, sat on her couch, watched the clip once. Just once, then looked out the window. A city of glass and granite buzzed, as if she hadn't just torn through centuries. And somewhere outside that window, she imagined little girls in classrooms, girls who looked like her, who were usually told to keep their tone polite, who now had a new frame of reference for what power could look like. A truth she had lived finally echoed back. She thought of her mother, her clients, every microaggression, dressed in professionalism, every slick robe and cold stare that challenged her to feel too small. And now, the robe had blinked for the first time. America didn't just witness a confrontation. It witnessed a collision between tradition and transformation, between reverence for systems and the demand they finally start revering people. That was the tension still pulsing through Washington the next morning. It wasn't over what she said. It was that she said it without asking permission. She hadn't just shifted conversation, she shattered a ceiling, and the echoes weren't done. Yet, Judge Samuel Alito walked into that hearing expecting another harmless round of questions, another opportunity to dodge, to cite tradition, to protect power behind a robe. But instead, he met Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman, a civil rights attorney, a daughter of grit, clarity, and refusal. And what he tried to sidestep, she walked right through, no shouting, no scene. Just calm, devastating truth. She didn't dismantle him with fury. She dismantled him with dignity. In 5 quiet minutes, she flipped the courtroom, exposed the contradictions behind originalism, and did what generations of hearings had failed to do: make a Supreme Court justice blink. Not just blink, backpedal, and the country noticed. From Twitter storms to classroom rewatches, from Reddit threads to pulpit sermons, that moment echoed, because it wasn't just a debate, it was a reckoning. And no matter how many robes or rules try to wrap power in tradition, Crockett reminded us all, you don't need to shout to speak loud. You don't need permission to tell the truth. So now, the question is yours. What would you have said to Justice Alito? Drop it in the comments. Let your voice be part of the record. Share this moment. Subscribe for more unfiltered truth. Join the fight in this comment section, in your community, in your own voice. Because this isn't just about a moment in court. It's about the America we're still building. Out loud and without backing down,